Madame Gallant. 6 minutes, please.
So first of all, Mr. Callan, digital ID that you mentioned, the certificates, are they just for work, or are you proposing this for everyday Canadians and personal use? And would Canadians be required by government to have them in order to access benefits and services?
So that is a slightly different question. So digital certificates are foundational to every digital process we have. So Canadian citizens are depending on them whether they know it or not. Now, if your question is, should the country demand a digital ID, as is done in a lot of European countries, that certainly is a wave that the world is moving toward. It provides a lot of benefits. It makes it easy to identify that you're real and not spoofed. Used properly, it can make interaction much easier for the average citizen who doesn't necessarily have a computer science degree. These have been used successfully in a number of European countries. There's also a pan-European standard that they call EIDAS, E-I-D-A-S, which is used broadly across the EU and the UK in order to do exactly that. It is a non-trivial effort to establish these kinds of things throughout government organizations, but government is a good place to start.
Okay.
As you see, sorry.
Okay, so it's mainly for industry, but some people use it for personal. Okay, so to Ms. Cianfarini, what are some of the resources your industries have the government does not have and is failing to understand that it doesn't have?
When you're talking resources, I assume you mean both services and product. The challenge right now is that much of certainly within the agencies, the resources are within the agencies, and the products typically have been developed within the agencies. So there isn't a lot of bleed over between where the capability gaps exist and exposure to those capability gaps to the industry, because it's not in the best nature of CSE to expose where it has capability gaps. So that is one of the number one issues, which is we don't know what we don't know. They do not know what we have, and we do not know where their capability gaps exist. However, what I can say is that the industry itself, about 60% of the industry has capability in securing networks and data infrastructure, which generally means we look after mission assurance. Mission assurance can be for networks in threat environments. It can also mean for sensors and assets like planes, ships, and tanks that operate in networked environments like in the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as the infrastructure like the cloud, for example, that the Armed Forces itself uses for its enterprise. We're also very strong in niche areas like encryption and penetration testing and threat monitoring, and the space assets that we maintain, operate, and deploy, such as RadarSat-2, are used for intelligence collection and targeting. So I can tell you what we have. I just can't tell you where the capability gaps exist within the agencies.
Okay, great. That was going to be my next question. In what ways does Canada expose itself to threats when it chooses to outsource to foreign companies as opposed to supporting its domestic infrastructure?
Well, I mean, I think that we are seeing a great movement by countries to secure supply chains. I referenced CMMC, which is effectively a way in which the Americans are looking at securing their entire supply chain. We would say that failure to adopt these kinds of standards or these kinds of methodologies to ensure that you have a secure supply chain is leading to increased vulnerability. We would also suggest that what you want in this particular sector, your best way of ensuring that your vulnerabilities are reduced in this particular sector is to employ Canadian citizens with Canadian security clearances in Canadian businesses that are paying Canadian taxes that have Canadian supply chains. And that's probably the best way that you can ensure that you would be reducing as much as possible the vulnerabilities.
Why do you think the government supports foreign companies instead of using Canadian industries?
I think the challenge is that it may not be necessarily adopting technologies from foreign countries. I believe that it's investing most of its funds, whether that's funds for resources or funds for technology, into its own organization. So CSC is increasing its resource pool and increasing the software and technologies that it itself creates for its own purposes, which is okay. We're not against that kind of behavior or activity, but what we're saying is that there's a lot more that the private sector could be bringing to the table, and certainly the Canadian private sector could be bringing to the table if we look at this issue holistically. And it's something that our allies have realized quite quickly. In our 2020 report, I believe, we interviewed a number of security experts from other countries, particularly the UK and the US, and they identified that over 50% of their cyber operations now are 50-50 split between contractor and agencies themselves. So they're moving in that direction.
Mr. Souza, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for your testimony. And actually, Ms. Ciaffarini? Ciaffarini, I apologize. I was really encouraged by your opening comments in respect to Canadian expertise, notwithstanding the fact that Canadians aren't necessarily utilizing them to the same effect as the other allies and the Five Eyes. And I was also struck by your comment that around the supply chain, that the speed of cyber is so fast, it's hard to keep up. So how do you keep up?
Well,
you're a professor in this very issue, in this very space.
Well, I spent a lot of time trying to keep up. I mean, I guess it comes down to having a whole entire industry around me that keeps me informed. So we share information, we share knowledge, and we have to be open to collaborating.
And I think that's part of your solution overall. That's exactly what you're trying to propose that others do in this space, and that Canada take a greater issue about trying to provide some of that sharing. Like when the supply chain risk that you talked about is critical, and when I consider what you're saying, what would then be your most immediate concern?
Well, I mean, there are a couple things. One is securing up that supply chain. Which means, on one hand, adopting regulatory standards as they become available. We are concerned 50% of the defense industrial base exports, and half of those exports go to the United States. So if we want to be a trusted partner in an American supply chain, we will need to be moving in lockstep with them to ensure that we can be trusted partners and that they will be able to procure from us. So that's number one. That's a pressing, almost like economic consideration for us as a country. And the second thing is just the sharing of information on threats. So you would have seen in the papers recently, there have been breaches through the private sector, through critical infrastructure providers or the defense industrial base. We need to ensure that there is a tighter connectivity and sharing of both those breaches in a proactive disclosure manner, and that we can leverage the technologies and agencies in order to get the best protections. So it's that quid pro quo, and it needs to be done in an institutionalized way. It can't be done every time an incursion occurs. There has to be a system that's already in place so that we can draw back on it if and when potentially cyber attacks escalate, which we've seen happening in the theater of war in the Ukraine right now.
Good point. Mr. Callan, did we just reference something around the overarching solution to the architecture alongside private sector? And you talked about the digital issues. Can you elaborate what kind of flexibility alongside our current cyber innovations? Like, how are we keeping up with cyber innovations and working more collaboratively with the private sector to enable success?
So there's a very robust private sector that has a lot of activity in terms of industry standards bodies and cooperative organizations. Again, I referred to the post-quantum cryptography as a great example of this, where people really around the globe came together to build a new architecture that was going to be able to defend against an identified emerging threat. And Canadian companies and academics did play a very important role in that. And I dare say Canadians punched above their weight in this regard, in this particular effort. And, you know, that's really what we need. It it isn't, nothing can exist just inside of the boundaries of one nation. The internet is bigger and technology is bigger than any one country. And we need to partner with each other to get the best, because the attackers do, and they don't care about borders. They just care about getting what they want to get. And by working together with other organizations, be it governmental or private, around the world, this is how technology providers can give the very best security posture to enterprises, government, et cetera.
So, Kristen, Kristen, so it was cited in one of the reports that the manufacturing sector is the most at risk, right? And some of, especially with regards to the supply. And being at Canadian companies are primarily SMEs, and some of this capacity and the critical mass exists in the States and other parts of the world. How do we overcome that?
Well, as we suggested, you need almost like an institutionalized method by which you can create the connections to collaborate between the industry, the private sector, and the agencies or the government bodies. In part, there has been good forward motion being taken by CCCS, so the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, which has started to stand up a portion of its organization. There are about, I believe, 6 people right now, but it can probably use a lot more considering the number of businesses that are out there. But it's started to stand up a portion of its organization, which is actually responsible for securing portions of the industrial base. Right now, the focus is critical infrastructure, but as we understand it, they're starting to look at the defense industrial base, which includes the manufacturing component that you're talking about. So it's kind of this slow creeping out of the idea that we need to be engaging companies. We need to be making them more aware to take their responsibility to become more, have more cyber hygiene. And in return for that, we will let those companies into the secret tent a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
Souza.
both.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup aux deux témoins pour votre présence.
Thank you very much to the 2 witnesses for their presentation. I'd like to talk about digital identity and the access of this by government. We even see that there are evil-intended external effects for automobile insurance, for example. When in Albania, for example, there was an attack by Iran on the digital government. The first weakest link seemed to be the human being, the player. Is the safety of Canadian users adequate? And do you think, I'd like a few comments too as to the Internet of Things, which might be a backdoor for ill-intended attacks.
Yes, the human being is always a weak link in every digital system. It's very easy to build mathematically pure cryptographic solutions that can't be defeated. It's much harder to teach people not to fall for tricks. We call this social engineering, and it has been going on since before there were computers. And it continues to be a very viable attack. Now, we can build our computer systems to help defend people against these kind of tricks. And you do this with things like cryptography. And by putting that in place, I can actually ensure that it is very difficult or impossible for a worker to give access unwittingly to a criminal, as long as I build the right systems in place. And these are the kinds of things that government and enterprises can pay attention to and can build. And this is one of the areas that we see that enterprises and government continue to be remiss in not doing everything that they're able to do. In terms of the Internet of Things, this is another area where things could be much stronger than they are. We can build cryptographically secure systems that prevent devices from being methods of ingress or possible areas for disruption to our systems, our infrastructure, our manufacturing, our transportation, et cetera. And once again, we often see these devices do not have the best of breed security. And this owes itself to problems like cost, form factor, size, available power, available bandwidth. And these other factors drive enterprises or drive manufacturers to skimp on security. And the consequences of that are potential attacks. We've seen a lot of them against automobiles. We've seen a lot of them against infrastructure.
Merci, Monsieur Callan. Comme j'ai pas beaucoup de temps, je voudrais aussi pouvoir poser des questions.
As I don't have much time, I'd like to ask a few questions to Ms. Ciaffarani. The obtention and acquisition of identical identity, some people wanted to apply to the agency, it's a security agency, but it's the RCMP apparently that they should address themselves to. So it's quite ambiguous and unclear as to how we go about it for the average citizen. Could we be a little bit more open, a better cooperation for those who are trying to link public and private sectors? Are our regulations a little too strict at the federal government? Is this what is hindering the cooperation?
Security clearances and classification. So I can't speak to how the agencies are screening to let in individuals with security clearances. What I can say is that because we face this on the defense file, we take a view in this country that we want the fewest security clearances possible, and we think that clearing less people will make us more safe, meaning the fewer people that have access to that kind of information and knowledge, it will make us a safer country because there will be perhaps less leaks or things like that. Other countries have taken a very different approach now. They're starting to declassify more and more information. We've actually seen that in real time in Ukraine, where the UK government's GCS is declassifying information in real time to show everyone a picture of what is going on. We're seeing that as well in the updated national security strategy coming out of the United States, where they're saying we're going to declassify more information to make the public more aware. So what I would say is that are the lens through which, whether it's screening or whether it's agencies or whether it's the contract security program in this country that does it for national defense, I think the lens, the idea that we need to keep people out instead of bring people in and make them more aware needs to change.
J'aimerais savoir.
Thank you. To what degree that this working in isolation and silos hinders our cooperative effort?
I think it greatly hinders our cooperative effort. We see it on a regular basis within government entities. So D&D CAF to the security agencies to the government. Not to bring in the proceedings of yesterday, but you saw it in real time in foreign interference in the government itself, holistically between departments, foreign affairs and public safety. We saw it in circumstances in Ottawa in the convoy situation, where government agencies, both provincially, municipally, and actually across the federal government, were not harmonized on approaches or information and threat sharing. And we see it, we feel it on our end in the private sector, where very often we're asking ourselves, what is going on? Do we need to be aware? Is the threat increasing or decreasing? So I think our siloed behavior is a hindrance to this country, and it's a shame because we're such a small nation.
We're going to have to leave it there. Ms. Madison, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for appearing today. Ms. Ciaffarani, did I do it right? Yeah. All right. Phew, there's a lot of pressure on that right now. So you had talked about that institutionalized standards. And of course, we've seen a lot of back and forth. There's been a lot of overall in terms of the idea of procurement between governments not having these longer term, neutral, nonpartisan type plans that have really gotten in the way of what I think you're talking about in terms of what the industry can do, what they can provide, how they can plan themselves, how they can build, especially when they're small, medium enterprises, as you said, is the majority of Canadian businesses. So could you discuss maybe some of the points around the fact that even now we seem to be shifting yet again. We had a government that went sole source for some procurement projects. Then it was refuted by another government saying, okay, we need an open bidding process. That took a very long time, cost a lot of money. Now we seem to be shifting back to that idea of urgent operational requirements, and a lot of procurement projects focusing on that to actually bypass that open source procurement. So can you talk about what that does to the industry overall, both from a cybersecurity perspective, but also in defense procurement overall?
So we've been talking a lot, and this is under the Defense Policy Review, Defense Policy Update, around a concept of continuous capability sustainment or agile procurement. What I can say is there is a time and a place for competition. Typically, nations compete when there are two foreign vendors and there is no Canadian incumbent. That is the normal way in which we see it happen around the world. When there is a Canadian incumbent, and what we're talking about here in this on the cyber side is you would want to have already trusted, curated Canadian businesses that you are prepared to deal with. Then and in those particular cases, sole sourcing is not and should not be viewed as a shortcut to the process. It should be the solution to agility. Where it goes sideways is when you don't understand that most nations use the process of sole sourcing or agile procurement to sustain, maintain, grow their businesses within their own countries. So meaning national security is economic security. They fundamentally understand by investing in a Canadian company and by doing that in an agile way with trusted sources or trusted individuals, we can effectively be investing in our economy.
But wouldn't it be the case then that the larger companies consistently would have, and they already have an edge, but more so would eliminate the ability for those small and medium-sized enterprises to truly compete at the same level?
Well, they don't compete at the same level. Small businesses are generally a part of the supply chain. So there are two ways in which small businesses generally get directed contracts. Either you have a niche technology that is, and that typically gets sought after by agencies in directed, very targeted purchases. Or you have platforms or larger projects where you have both a vendor of a thing, like a chip, a plane, or whatever, and that OEM has an entire supply chain. And in those cases, what you want to do is get in on the ground floor in being a supply chain partner, so a trusted partner to those OEMs, which means that you want to position your defense industrial base or your industrial base as players within that supply chain, which is where when we come to the idea of we need to ensure that we're trusted supply chain partners by making sure that we have the appropriate regulations in place so that we don't end up with non-tariff trade barriers. In other words, those OEMs saying, you can't play in my sandbox because you're not certified. That's the way in which we ensure that the smaller business is get a piece of the action, if you will.
Okay. So, I mean, and we are seeing quite a lot of that within procurement, right? Not one company, or one company can't maybe potentially do it all. So they do outsource all of those pieces. They do try, especially if there are requirements in terms of Canadian procurement, Indigenous procurement, for example, to try and meet some of those percentage standards or what have you. But how, again, can we ensure that those are, mainly Canadian, if they're part of, like, they're the puzzle pieces to create the overall larger standard, and that they're not actually just consumed, like we're seeing in the telecom industry, that they're not just consumed by the larger?
It can happen. I mean, you know, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There are various incentives you can use. So in our country, we have what we would call an offset policy or an industrial and technological benefit policy, which is applied at the time at which you do procurement. And that incentivizes prime contractors to use Canadian businesses within their supply chains in order to get Canadian government contracts. So you can do those kinds of things. You can also dictate in terms of your requirements, I want you to work with that vendor because they have that technology. You can specify it in the way in which you do business. And in the case of cyber and agile procurement, what we would argue is that you would already have pre-trusted Canadian firms, and you would simply source directly to them, and that would expedite the process. You already have your trusted partners with the proper classifications that you need, and you would be able to go back to that base again and again.
Thank you, Ms. Madsen. Colleagues are, again, the same problem. I think we're going to try and run a full 25-minute round. We may be chewing into the second hour, but I think it's inappropriate that we do that. So, Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
So, in the CATSI report, it's noted that while we take in Canada years and sometimes decades, adversaries and allies both have demonstrated their ability to deploy new cyber capabilities in months or weeks. Just how broken is PSPC?
Well, we're trying to apply a model that wasn't designed for agile procurement to agile procurement. So what we're suggesting isn't that the current model is broken, it's the current model is being inappropriately applied to technology.
So the PSPC model is an inappropriate model for cybersecurity?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the right. So the urgency is that from your report is rooted in the fact that cyber threats go faster than government decision-making processes. What does the government have to do to be able to actually make timely decisions to protect Canadians in the realm of cybersecurity?
Well, in the model, I mean, time is the enemy. So in our report, you would have seen, and the report you're referring to, I assume, is the 2021 Procurement at Cyber Speed. So page 18, for those of you that have it, it's a good read. But there are really like three things that could be done, which is, you start to create these umbrella projects that procure capability. So like I suggested, you break down those barriers where you have trusted partners. There is a capability development and sustainment that is resident within the country, and you allocate funding at an umbrella level. The other thing that you could do is have more flexible funding. So right now we have a whole approvals process, goes through Treasury Board. There's about 200 steps if you take the old model. You would sort of get rid of all that sausage making, if you will, and you would consider a vote of funding that has the flexibility of like a vote 1 and the ability to acquire new capability of vote 5. And then the last thing you could do is that you can fast track the approval and contracting process by, like I said, where you have, by setting guidelines, which is where you have technology and services made by Canadian nationals with Canadian security clearances in trusted, curated Canadian businesses where taxes are paid in Canada and IP rests in Canada. Boom, I can buy that.
Okay, thank you. A number of years ago, the Government Operations Committee studied procurement by small and medium-sized enterprises. You talked about the differences and how so many vendors in cybersecurity are and cyber defense are in fact small enterprises. The committee heard that small enterprises they can't cope with the requirements of the current procurement system, and that it is so complicated and so impossible to deal with PSPC that it has become a niche, that only niche vendors whose whole business model is simply figuring out how to game the procurement system, that you have de facto sole source contracting because there's just no competitors. Is that a particular issue within procurement for cybersecurity?
Well, I think you would have heard from the agencies that did do the testimony, which is they effectively don't procure. So I believe what they do is they're looking at that system and they're imagining if we had to apply that system to procuring cyber technology, boy, would that be an impediment, which is why one of the reasons why they potentially don't do it. And so is the system cumbersome, somewhat unwieldy, and is there a whole cottage industry around how to use it? Absolutely. Which is why we're frequently here at the table saying this can be made much better. And particularly for cyber, there are many ways in which it can be made much better and much more agile.
Right, indeed. Okay, would you like to elaborate on recommendation number 4 from your report on just on the modernization of cyber procurement for the next 20 seconds?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, there were sort of those three things. I don't want to reiterate them more than I already have, but again, concept of umbrella projects where there's a big chunk of funding and you can allocate it to sub-projects, meaning I could buy various technologies, try it out, and integrate it into my enterprise in a very expedient manner. That funding doesn't have to go continuously up and through Treasury Board or various approval levels. So once I get a base chunk of funding, I can start allocating it through projects. And then lastly, this fast-tracked process by which if it meets a number of criteria that we believe is good economically and good security-wise, that we can procure it in an agile manner without having to go through all 200 and some steps to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Ms. O'Connell, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start, Ms. Rachel, or Kristen. Forget it. I can't do
Perfect, Kristen.
Thank you. You spoke about in the private sector and kind of governments working with private sector. But we've also heard testimony that there can be challenges as well, that in the private sector, they also are not necessarily inclined to share with governments when there has been a security breach, and there may be a reason for that. There could be, trade secrets involved, or they don't want their customers or board members to know that there are vulnerabilities. So with that being said, if there is a role for government to help or do a better job in kind of that coordination, how do you then recommend or propose that we bring private sector along to also be more open and transparent with potential breaches? Because that would also help government in preparing of, what's out there and what threats exist.
You're very right. You've got sticks and carrots. I'd like to look at it that way. In some cases, the sticks could be compelling businesses to disclose their breaches. And most businesses that we talk to say, as long as we are involved with how that would occur, where the information would go, and that it is done in a proactive way where our brand or our business is not damaged in the process. In other words, you flip the lens and say, proactive disclosure is a good thing. No one should be ashamed that they are breached because it's only a matter of time. So you frame it in that way, and then you say, when you proactively disclose to us, the return that you will get from that is that you will get others' vulnerabilities so that you can become a better business. So it's a quid pro quo type of relationship. And I think those are the missing pieces, right? If you want to compel, you need to invite business in to figure out how to do that in an effective way that doesn't damage their business. In the same vein, you're going to be sharing that information back, which is something that we want, which will make us better and more secure in the overall ecosystem.
Thank you. And then in your opening statement, you mentioned, I believe it was the London example or in the UK, there is an example of...
UK 100?
Yes, thank you. I was just curious, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what that looks like and how old is it? Is it kind of new in its inception, or how could we emulate maybe some of the best parts of that? Could you maybe elaborate on that example?
Yeah, so it's a collaborative model. It's not so new anymore. Okay. Essentially, it's a program that helps solve sort of short-term labor supply shortages for specialized talent. Industry puts staff into the National Security Cyber Center. So that would be, and on their team, so that would be like us placing our resources into CSE, for example, and they do that on a part-time basis. And there is no separation between the industrial partners, meaning that these industrial partners could be competitors at some point in time, but when they come and they moonlight into the NCSC, they are doing so together with government staff on a neutral territory on a non-transactional basis. So they're not paid for that activity for the common good of the UK national security. And these individuals in the private sector can do everything from drafting white papers to developing software to being the liaison between their organization and the government entity on threats and incursions that are going on. So it's a national type of activity.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Do you think that, just following up on that, in the UK, when I was on the finance committee and we did our annual review of the anti-money laundering study, and we traveled to the UK, and we heard that there's a different culture, especially when it comes to this openness and security, because there are quite frequently more terrorist attacks localized. And so there's more of an acceptance within the public. Even, for example, registries for mortgages are quite common. But in Canada, and I would say maybe even North America, the culture for kind of that information is a little bit trickier to convince Canadians kind of open in that measure. Do you have any thoughts on that? I think
that's a very true statement, and we see that kind of urgency all the time, right? EU is in the theater of war right now, and Canadians, I think, while we sort of feel it, we don't feel it to any great extent. It's one of the reasons why we say, if there is a portion of the population or a portion of the business community that is probably more wired to be a little bit more accepting of those kinds of things, it is the defense industrial base, right, by nature.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's no chance we're going to make time here. 2.5 minutes, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être
Thank you very much. Ms. Ciaffarani, on the CCAMC that you spoke about, you mentioned that Canada is not using its own standard, that we should use that one instead. To your knowledge, is Canada working on its own standard or not?
Is right now studying CMMC so the embassy in the Canadian embassy in the United States is actually actively monitoring and working on and to some extent D&D and public safety are looking at, and PSPC actually are looking at that standard. The challenge is they're trying to understand whether they need specific Canadianizations to the standard. We believe if we do that, developing the Canadianized portions of the standard will A, create a different standard. B, it will mean that Canadian companies have to have two standards, which increase costs. And C, if we don't get it right, the Americans could be moving forward and Canadian companies could be waiting for the Canadian standard and therefore be left behind when it comes out in procurements. So there's that sense of urgency. They are working on it. We have a Pathfinder program right now that is trying to pull Canadian businesses in to actually participate in the American standard as it goes through.
Monsieur Callan.
Mr. Cullen, a question for you. You spoke of quantic computers, which can outgame security in many cases. I'd like you to tell us about the speed, how urgent this and the obtention of this counter equipment or strategies would be. And rated. Go ahead.
Already too late in that there's an attack that they call harvest and decrypt, which is if someone gets inside of your system and they can grab blobs of encrypted data and just store them, then sometime in the future when they have a quantum computer, they can open that up. And so for secrets that will still be valuable in 10 years, let's say, like military secrets or advanced industrial secrets, those things may already be lost. For other secrets, maybe not, but it is very urgent that we get post-quantum cryptography in place really as soon as we can.
Thank you, Ms. Normandine. 2.5 minutes, Ms. Madsen.
Obviously, one of the things that's plaguing all industry in Canada and around the world is that labor side and that human resource side of development. Is Canada doing enough at that post-secondary education level? And this is directed to you, Ms. Farani, sorry, that to train those future needs. And you had spoken about that UK model, but in terms of that sharing of personnel, of that going back and forth, are we doing enough within colleges, universities, to ensure that we have the people going forward that actually are building these systems, that are working within these systems at all? And what could we do to make that better?
It's hard because stepping out of my swim lane a little bit, because I'm not really in the university models or in high school anymore, I guess. But I do think across Canada, we understand that there is a talent shortage. We also understand, I think, that we're a little bit shy about being, I think, directive in terms of incentives for, let's say, pushing certain classes of study or areas where we want to develop talent to have it come out the other side. Meaning, we don't really do things like say, you can get a greater or bigger bursary if you go into this particular area of study, right? We want to encourage all Canadians to have equal access to education, post-secondary education, university education. So we're not very directive about what pipelines we want that education to occur in, so that we can develop the talent for the future, right? I do think we could do more as a nation to have potentially incentive programs around directing education and talent into a variety of swim lanes, if you will, to be able to create the next generation of individuals around the areas that we believe are critical for the country. But that comes down to setting national priorities about where you want your talent base to emerge.
Thank you, Ms. Madsen. Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Witnesses for being here, and it's great to see Ms. Jen Farani here again.
I would just follow up on what Ms. Matheson was just saying. And you mentioned the difficulty in getting people the national security clearances and top secret clearances. And when we have a shortage in the workforce, that becomes even more difficult. In discussions around Bill C-26 right now, Business Council of Canada is saying that we're short 26,000 people in the cybersecurity industry as it is right now, unfilled positions. So aside from the point of trying to produce more of those people here through our education system, would it be appropriate to employ foreign nationals who are coming from Five Eye Nation partners and have been approved through their processes?
Well, I mean, I think you'd have to do, your appropriate due diligence and screening to ensure that they would be trusted partners. First and foremost, before we would go down that path, what I would say is, you've got a lot of veterans leaving national defense and security agencies and otherwise that have security clearances that the day they walk out the door, they lose that clearance, and it takes them 2 years or a year and a half to get it back. So maybe we would want to look inside to expedite the processes and the barriers that currently exist, first and foremost. And then, yes, it could be, certainly a possibility to look at individuals from most assuredly the Five Eyes, our Five Eyes partners, to be able to provide competency and talent within our own country.
Yeah, I love that suggestion. We definitely need to empower our veterans as they're exiting the Canadian Armed Forces, and I also agree with you. That's a perfect place for them to take on their new public life and as a private citizen is in the cyber world at an industrial level, telecoms, but also with the defense industries. Now, you did talk about a holistic approach, collective cybersecurity. We hear of stories in the past of
from American sources that certain technologies have been hacked into by going down, accessing third-party providers that might have access to schematics of things like F-35s or cruise missiles that have been then proliferated on the global scene by our adversaries. Has the Government of Canada been serious enough about that type of collective defense to ensure that we are trying to provide a most secure system possible, that everybody from the government workplace to the primary contractor to the subcontractors to all employees are doing everything possible to protect that intel?
I think we've been very, as we said, we've been quite slow at it. Certainly the agencies, and even to some extent, national defense, have frequently, our siloed approach means we look after ourselves, right? So the agencies look after the government, the CAF looks after the CAF, and industry, well, you look after yourself. And what we're learning is that approach that we use, it's not working. So if we want to secure supply chains from the lowest common denominator, which is where a lot of the incursions occur because they are the most vulnerable, meaning the small business or the small business provider that may or may not have the equipment or skills to be able to do the cyber hygiene at the level necessary, then you have to create those institutions or agencies or outreach to be able to get them to be more cyber aware and to have the appropriate protection. So make those protections available to them, help protect those companies, and incentivize them. And incentivizing can be that stick and carrot, meaning if you want to do business with the Canadian government, if you want to do business in the supply chains, you need to get your CMMC certification, for example. There may be regulations that we have to impose on companies in order to be able to up our game with the quid pro quo of once you're inside the tent, you're inside the tent.
So how many Canadian suppliers of cybersecurity, both from the services side as well as from the infrastructure side, are currently competitive on the global scene? You mentioned that we do encryption and penetration well. What do we do well and is something that is valued by our partners, particularly within NORAD, but for sure within Five Eyes?
Well, like I said,
very briefly, please.
About 25% of the industry, and 60% of it is along that mission assurance. So 60% of 25%, and please don't ask me to do math because I'm an English major, but that portion is actively engaged in government contracts of our Five Eyes partners.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. Fisher, final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We've been looking at the cybersecurity risk to critical infrastructure and in the context of cyber warfare and threats to Canada's defense and security. Now, manufacturing is one of the 10 critical infrastructure sectors identified by public safety. Mr. Callan, how does defense manufacturing represent a target for foreign state-backed cyber intrusions?
Yeah, absolutely it does. So defense manufacturing is critical to the defense infrastructure. And if you can go poison those processes, you can hurt it. You furthermore can steal secrets. Stealing secrets is a big one, right? There's a lot to be gained there, and it will be gained for a long time. It has to do with plans for the future, existing provisioning capacity, and all of those things are very valuable as targets for what we call an advanced persistent threat, a state-sponsored actor from somebody who might want to hurt Canada, and we can imagine who that would be. And, to the degree that the government is a target, it is, but also the organizations, the private contractors who provide to the government can be targets as well. And that's another way that the state-sponsored actors can get the information they're trying to get.
Can you give me some examples of how industry is working or planning to work towards mitigating this risk?
So there is a vast raft of strategies and technologies that are needed. One of the things to understand is that, you really have to build a security fortress, and any way in is a way in. And so you have to look for complete comprehensive coverage, while the attacker just needs to find one gap or one hole or one vulnerability. And as we mentioned, this could be things like social engineering attacks. This could be things like inadequate encryption. This could be things like firewalls and email protections that are not quite in place. So it's very complex. And there are professionals who dedicate their entire lives to understanding and staying current on these activities, and there are entire departments that focus on this, and there need to be.
Sia Farani, welcome back. You used the term cybersecurity as a team sport. I'm a big supporter of partnerships. I'm a big supporter of working together. What opportunities, and you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can wrap this up in a bow. What opportunities exist for Canadian cybersecurity firms, traditional defense industry partners, and government to work together to better protect manufacturing and our supply chains?
Well, I mean, as we talked about, we're 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country is actually owned and operated by the private sector. So we have a very important role in securing our own infrastructure, to keeping everyone safe, right? Secondly, we have talent and expertise within our organizations, and are continuously developing and innovating, so we can bring that competency to the agencies in order to keep them on the bleeding edge of what is available to protect Canada and Canadian society as well. So it's that exchange, let's call it that collaborative exchange, where we can all be better as a nation if we're willing to open up a little bit to each other.
You crammed a lot in your opening 5-minute comments, and you talked about the cybersecurity standard, the global standard, or the need for a global standard.
CMMC, yeah.
Right. So Canada's looking at, is Canada looking at, and Madame Normandin, I think, touched on this a little bit, is Canada looking at joining a global standard or following the American standard, or is that what you're suggesting that we do?
So they're studying the American standard that is going through the process of becoming a standard. It will be imposed on us. It will be imposed on anyone who wants a piece of a DoD contract in the near future or in the future. So we're looking at it from we're in that supply chain, so we are going to have to use it anyway. We're going to have to make sure that the industry is in line with it and has adopted it. But secondly, do we want to adopt it in Canada? So national defense, for example, would make reference to that standard for its own procurement of products and services. And does it need to be the standard by reference, meaning exactly what the Americans have? Or is there something particular that we have to add for Canada?
Thank you.
Mr. Fisher. Before I suspend, I just wanted to get some clarification on your comment about declassification. I've been privileged to have been briefed on secret stuff, and I've wondered at time to time whether I've already read this in the Globe and Mail somewhere. It does strike me as we have an excessively cautious view of what constitutes classified information. So I don't know how much thinking you've done about this, but I'd be interested in 30 seconds worth of your thoughts on this matter.
I haven't delved deep into the subject, but I would concur with your assessment. I think classifying things initially became a way that people with that information kept value. And so by transferring that value, you have to ask, what am I bringing to the table again? We also have a fear in this country of, what will people do with that information, and can it come back to harm us? I think Canadians by nature and the government institutions that go with it are a bit more risk averse than our allies are. And that perhaps comes from the fact that we don't feel like we are in risky situations very often where we need to take risk. So I think it's kind of a perpetrating model, and it's not getting us as far as we need to get. And I think it, requires reflection. Do we need to classify all the things that we need to classify? And can more people have access to information? And can more information be declassified? So as Canadians, we become smarter, better, and more nuanced about what's going on. And it's not about making us afraid. It's about making us more educated.